All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining for this February 9th session. This kicks off or continues our public speaker series. And for those who are unable to be in attendance, as well as those who are currently participating, I have created a flyer for y'all to distribute that showcases the different speakers that we're going to be having for the remainder of this semester. So I will send that to you with the link to the recording from today. And I would ask that you share that with at least two, three friends available to you so that we can try to promote greater participation in these conversations. This reference might be a bit dated, but this may feel a bit like a chainmail ask. If you don't forward this request to three friends, you'll be cursed with I won't even tell you what those emails used to say, but it would be greatly valuable. And I think, as we all agreed earlier in the semester, a valuable way to hear from some additional perspectives as we can carry on with this conversation series. On that note, I wanted to notify y'all that I was able to confirm an additional speaker for April 12th. I have updated the calendar in the shared drive, as well as added some cool readings that I came across during the week. So I would ask that you continue to monitor the Google shared drive for additional information. But on April 12th, from our standard time of 4 to 5:30, we will be discussing legal and ethical considerations in social media surveillance, and we'll be joined for that session by Marcia Thompson from Aurora University. Arsha recently published an article for the International Association of Chiefs of Police magazine on that topic with some other police chiefs. So she is very well positioned to talk about these things. And as we'll get a bit of an introduction to today, the role of social media in policing, both as it relates to the community as well as monitoring what police themselves are doing and saying, is a very interesting space for us to be aware of, particularly with our focus on artificial intelligence this semester, which I'm going to take as my segue into our speaker for today. When I decided that AI was going to be our area of focus for this semester, I started kind of at that 50,000 feet level. Who is talking about this? What do we currently know? Where are we going? And the name Andrew Ferguson continued to come up in all of my research. And so, like, well, this is going to be shooting for the stars to try to get him to speak to this group. But fortunately, I reached out and Mr. Ferguson was wildly responsive and eager and keen to speak with us. So I'm very grateful for that. He is a professor at American University, which is one of our consortium member schools. So I want to give a shout out to his home school, as well as the fact that he is a neighbor, as I also am here in Washington, D.C. But you'll forgive me for giving a brief read of your bio. Try not to blush too readily. But Professor Ferguson is a national expert on predictive policing, big data policing, and emerging surveillance technologies. He's the author of the book, The Rise of Big Data Policing, Surveillance, Race, and the Future of Law Enforcement. His legal scholarship focuses on the digital transformation of the criminal legal system, and he is a frequent commentator in the national media. In 2017, Professor Ferguson co-authored the law professor's amicus brief to the Supreme Court on behalf of the petitioner in Carpenter versus the US, involving the warrantless collection of cell site tracking data. He serves as a technology fellow at the NYU Law School's Policing Project, examining the civil rights, privacy, and public safety aspects of new surveillance technology. He is also an advisor to the American Law Institute Principles of the Law Policing Project. So we are thrilled to have you with us today. As I mentioned in previous emails, we're at the earlier side of our semester, so really grateful that you can help us have more of a grounding understanding of your area of expertise. Thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Sure. Thanks for having me. I am looking forward to a conversation about predictive policing and its role in America for the last, let's say, 12 years or so. Happy to talk about both like what has happened, what will happen, how it impacts the law, the Fourth Amendment, and everything else. First question, can you all hear me? Is this okay? Am I going to keep you going on a Friday evening to excite you about the dangers of data-driven surveillance? That was not a full nod there. I saw some not ones, but it's okay. I have some slides here. I'm going to try to share if I can do that. Let me see if this works for us. Let's see from the beginning. All right, how's that? Can you see that? All good? All right. So my task today is to sort of give you a rundown of predictive policing and its impacts on society. I'm going to try to do it relatively quickly, although it's a rather large subject because you have to talk about person-based predictive policing, place-based predictive policing. You can do kinds of other kinds of predictive policing. I think it's important and topical right now for two reasons. One is that just last week, the Senator Wyden, Ron Wyden, and several fellow Democrats just issued a letter to the Department of Justice saying, please stop funding any predictive policing because it appears you have no idea how it works, where it's being used, who's really being impacted. And until you can answer those questions, which we asked you, this is the senator saying, last year, until you answer this, please stop it. So it's become actually a news story in the idea that maybe DOJ will simply stop funding it, or maybe they won't. Let's ignore the senators. And second, it's a big idea because it dovetails with this idea of where data-driven policing is going and a larger conversation about how we are shifting to essentially a battle of data-driven platforms that are going to control policing. And we're going to get to that because the history of predictive policing kind of dovetails with where we are now, where that platform battle begins. So here it begins 10 or so years ago, 12 years ago, in 2011. You can actually trace the beginning of predictive policing to 2009. The National Institute of Justice had a conference about the rise of this new concept called predictive policing. And it came from early experiments in New York City with what's called ComStat, basically data-driven collection that helped figure out where police should go. Was then operationalized in Los Angeles with a company called Predpo, which we'll talk about, where they basically had the theory that they could take past crime data, crunch it through an algorithm, and predict where crime would occur, and then send police cars there. It was adopted in Chicago in a person-based form, like, well, if you can identify places of risk, maybe we can identify people of risk and send police officers to their door. And then it spread. It spread because there was a lot of buzz. It spread because it sounded like the next new thing in policing, and it spread because there was a desire for police chiefs to do something, anything really, to respond to crime. And if those pressures sound familiar, is that we're seeing them again today. Just if you're in DC, which I guess Jocelyn is, that the DC City Council just passed a very regressive law and order based policing package. And it shows that the desire to sort of amplify police power and surveillance power is very real. And we may see it, we'll continue to see it again as we build out these systems. So it begins in 2011-ish to really take form. And it was based on this idea that we could take data that police were collecting anyway, run it through an objective algorithm, objective in quotes, and be able to make police more efficient in what they did, right? Police are going to go on patrol. They have to go somewhere. If we have data to tell them where to go, maybe this will work for them. It happened post sequestration. Some of you are probably too young to remember that, but after the recession 2008, 2009, we had a huge cutbacks everywhere. And so police said, you know what? We don't have more police, but we have new technology. And so that is what we are going to use, and that's what we're going to invest in. And so predictive policing was born. I'm going to talk about the two different kinds of predictive policing. The first is place-based predictive policing. And again, the idea is relatively simple. We have data about where crime occurs. If we could use some algorithm to identify where crime will occur in the future, it might make sense to use that data. And so there were entities, and we'll talk about some of the companies involved, but entities, companies that basically said, look, we can identify 500 by 500 square foot, basically a city block of crime. We can look at the past crime, be able to figure out what's happened and then tell you where you, Mr. Police Officer, Ms. Police Officer, should be sitting at this time at this place in the future. It sounded good because if you were right, you would deter the crime, right? If there was a ongoing series of car thefts from a parking lot and you send a police car there, probably not going to be a robbery. That was the theory of predictive policing. It was based on certain kinds of crimes, primarily burglaries, car thefts, and thefts from auto. It had different iterations in terms of their people did different things with the data, but generally speaking, past crime data, future prediction, send a police car to the area. The companies behind it was a company called Predpol. They were first out and got to be the most famous. They were renamed after there was a backlash in predictive policing called Geolitico, and they are now owned by a company called Sound Thinking, which you may have heard as like ShotSpotter, formerly known as ShotSpotter Audio Detection, now owns their at least the algorithms and the proprietary data. They just purchased them last year. HunchLab, another company, a startup company, also purchased by Sound Thinking. You're going to see where we're going with the platform idea later on. But they too had an idea. We could take past crime data, run through some machine learning algorithms to be able to predict where police go and what to do there. And then there was an entity out of Rutgers University that's now actually a private company as well that said we could look at places, locations, fixed objects. Maybe it's like liquor stores or bus stops or gas stations, and we can tell you by the grouping of these sort of fixed structures where there are higher risk of crime and why. And that was their pitch. And we'll talk a bit about what their theory was and the different things. But again, the simplest version and the most famous version was Predpol. Predpol actually spread across America pretty rapidly. And it was a relatively simple algorithm based on an earthquake seismology, like the idea like earthquakes, you can predict the near repeats, the after effects of an earthquake. They basically use that algorithm to say they're actually after effects of predictive policing. And they weren't just making it up. There's actually good social science to say that particular kinds of crimes are almost viral. So if you live in a neighborhood and a house gets burglarized, it's actually statistically more likely that the other houses in the neighborhood will get burglarized. Same thing with a car theft. If a certain car areas, it's more likely that the people will go back to that particular area and commit a crime. Why? Because there's usually an environmental vulnerability that's attracting crime. Like maybe it's dark, maybe there's no streetlights, maybe there are easy getaway places, maybe there are no cops. And so when they've looked at statistically, like it's actually true that certain kinds of property crimes are predictive in that way. And all Predpol did was make that into an algorithm and then sell it to police departments across America. HunchLab was sort of the next iteration of this, essentially taking that same idea, different algorithm, the same idea, and embedding it in cop cars. So you would be driving around in your police car and you'd have little like red squares of predicted high crime. So if you were the police officer, you'd be suddenly driving through an area of higher crime and you would know, oh, this is a high aggravated assault area. Oh, this is a high murder area, whatever it would be. And that was supposed to impact how you did your job. It's not clear exactly what you were supposed to do with that information, which is one of the problems, but that was the idea. We could actually take this, give it to police in real time, let them know the higher risk areas in the city. Again, as I said, RTM, risk terrain modeling, which is now SimC, had this idea that you could take certain risk factors in the fixed environment of a neighborhood and predict crime. So they say, look, if there was a bus stop and a liquor store and an ATM, you might be able to predict like where the robbery is going to happen because someone's going to be hanging out at the bus stop. They're going to know someone's going to get money from the ATM. They'll be able to, you can actually hang out at bus stops without getting stopped by police and harassed. So it's actually a good place to be. And oh, they're going to go from there to ATM to liquor store. They'll get intoxicated, so we'll rob them afterwards. And they could actually come up with some interesting risk narratives about how certain crimes happened in certain places and for certain reasons. And they came up with a sort of predictive strategy to tell police where they should be looking. Again, some of it's sort of obvious. So, for example, they found a correlation between gas stations and murders, shootings. And the reason why, of course, was that gas stations in certain parts of New Jersey were the only thing open after 2 a.m. And so if you're going to hang out somewhere, you're going to hang out at the gas station, and those people who are hanging out at the gas station at 2 a.m. might also be in trouble, getting in trouble with each other. And so there wasn't it's not illogical that there might be a shooting or a violent act around the gas station. That was the theory behind it. They could predict it, they could show the data, and then try to respond to it. What do? Put a cop car at the gas station. Talk to the gas station people about their security systems and everything else. Like again, not rocket science, but also not wasn't being done before we had this sort of innovation of place-based predictive policing. Real concerns that come with it. One is the remedy, like what do you do with that information, right? Knowing you have just driven into an area that is statistically more likely for aggravated assault. Okay, what are you supposed to do? Like, is everyone going to assault someone? No, of course not. It doesn't really tell the police what to do. I wasn't always clear in terms of Predpol and HunchLab whether it was actually that effective. They couldn't actually show it necessarily was bringing down crime. Like crime would go up and down. It wasn't necessarily not helping, but they didn't know it could help, and so there was all these problems of correlation. There's an open question of whether it's better than police patrols. One of the things to debate is, well, if you don't use data to determine where police go and you send police on their own, is that better? Like you're just randomly driving about? Wouldn't you rather have some information, even if that information is wrong or erroneous? Like, isn't it as wrong and erroneous as a police officer's judgment? Open questions that were part of the debate. And the idea of this deterrence theory that if you put the police off the right place at the right time, wasn't always clear that that would necessarily drive down crime. It might just displace crime. But they had some studies to show that actually that kind of deterrent effect, did some work. There are obviously concerns. One issue is like, where do you get the data in order to do the prediction? Huge concern, right? If you're taking information from what police do, you are obviously going to be focused on where police have always focused. So if police are patrolling poor areas, communities of color, and that's their data from where crimes are coming. That might be different than if you took it from, say, calls for service, like my car was burglarized. It was wherever I was. My home was burglarized. It is wherever it would be. It's not necessarily what police are doing. So obviously a concern about whether your data inputs were correct or not correct, and questions about the data inputs were colored by problems of policing in America. Race is a big one in terms of if you are focused on a city that has a problem of disproportionate, police contacts with minorities, is that information going to taint your data-driven policing? Isn't it going to sort of reify some of those structural problems that may not have to do with where crime is, but just where you're seeing crime, because that's where you are? An open question. A lot of these companies were companies, so they were kind of secret. They weren't being very transparent about how they were getting their information or what they were using it. So it created a level of suspicion around that lack of transparency. And then the legal issues, like, so what do you do with it? These are police officers making stops. Does it impact the law at all? And one of the big questions I asked and written about is about, if the Supreme Court has said that a quote unquote high crime area results in essentially easier suspicion for a police officer to stop someone, well, what's a predictive policing box but a predicted high crime area? So if I happen to be, walking through the predicted little red square, have I lost my Fourth Amendment rights? Do I have lesser Fourth Amendment rights because some algorithm said that this is a higher risk area at some point at some time for some crime? It's kind of weird if that's true. It doesn't really seem like it makes sense, and yet that's the sort of cost of applying the Supreme Court's reasonable suspicion doctrine to algorithmic policing, is that it could actually alter Fourth Amendment risk. And again, the way that plays out in the real world is an officer's like, so, I stopped the person because the predictive algorithm told me to be on the lookout for a burglary. I saw this guy, he's carrying a bag. He was in the spot where they said to look out for a burglary. I wouldn't normally have stopped him, but the computer told me that he was going to be suspicious, so I stopped him. And how do you entangle that? Is that saying that we can factor into the Fourth Amendment? Not. Why? Really open questions and fun to discuss. Place-based predictive policing hasn't really been litigated much. You haven't seen courts wrestle with it. You can only find a handful of cases even mentioning it in the last 12 years. And part of that's because the officers were told not to necessarily put predictive policing into their police reports, but also because it's hard and people wanted to avoid the complicated issues. But they're really interesting questions we can talk about at the end about whether predictive policing should be thought of like a tip. We allow anonymous tips. Should be like a profile. You profile a neighborhood like you profile a person. We allow that, and the Supreme Court has allowed that. Is there a collective knowledge doctrine issue where if you know one officer knows one thing, another officer knows another thing, the courts will say, oh, we can consider both together. Is this like a collective knowledge problem? Again, really interesting doctrinal questions that come from the idea that places can be predicted, and that might impact what police do in communities where it's been predicted. Shifting just to person-based predictive policing, just to get our terminology out. So again, the success, about success in quotes, of place-based predictive policing meant that there was a curiosity of, well, maybe we could take these same insights and apply them to people. Obviously, people commit crimes. We'd rather stop people than places. And so maybe we can find risk factors that will identify the individuals who might be involved in crime, and we'll try to stop them before they do anything. It was known as person-based predictive policing. It's now known kind of focused deterrence. Same idea. We can identify risk factors, take that information, and be able to apply that insight to do something. Again, the something is a big question for police. In Chicago, they had for a while this thing called the heat list. If you made the heat list, you were identified with a literal score, 0 to 500 plus. You can see on the slide, it's a 500 plus. And that meant if you were like pulled over, the police officer could like run your name on a system and see that you were a high risk, a 500 plus person. That meant that you were more likely to be involved in a violent crime, or maybe actually be the victim of violent crime, because they didn't separate it out. The risk scores looked at your past crime history, whether you've been arrested before, whether you've been arrested for a violent crime, whether you've been shot before, and the sort of collection of risk factors was sort of added up, simple arithmetic in some ways, and it was put into this heat list, and then police were supposed to do something with it. And we'll talk a bit about what they're supposed to do and what they didn't do. But of course, concerns about bias and race, almost all, the vast majority of people in that system were poor men of color. There was obviously a lot of sort of police-generated suspicion because the police were making conducts, police were making arrests, and if that became part of your risk factors, that was going to be a problem. And we'll talk about just two quick examples, how it went south. In Chicago, the heat list basically failed. It failed for a couple of reasons. One, there was no actual proof that those risk factors were necessarily going to be able to identify the people who would be involved in violent crime. What the theory behind it was that in Chicago, there were enough sort of small groups of sort of gangs or cliques or crews who were fighting each other and were engaged in kind of reciprocal acts of violence. So if you shoot me, I gotta go shoot you and your friends. You just got shot, you gotta come back to me. And they could kind of predict if you shot this person, this next person was going to take revenge. And so they tried to operationalize that. But it largely failed because it got too big. And while they could predict people who might be involved in this sort of violence thing, they didn't know what to do with it, right? What do you do with that if you can't arrest people? They haven't done anything yet. And in fact, they might be a victim. So what they tend to do was actually go knock on their door with a letter. It's called a custom notification letter. It's like, hey, we've done the risk analysis and we think you're more at risk of being a victim of a crime or involved in a crime than anyone else. Here's a list of services that you could, work on. And they sort of left it at that. And obviously, that's not a very effective system to divert people from a life of poverty and neglect and poor schools and lack of educational opportunities. And it didn't really work, but they built this list up that went from a small name of 1,400 names to eventually like over 400,000 names. So almost everyone being arrested in Chicago was given a score, even if you were arrested like at a Blackhawks game for getting drunk, still were given a score. And like it just got too big and too unwieldy, and they couldn't show it worked anyway. And so it dropped out. Other similar systems have taken place in other places. Palantir did something equivalent in New Orleans, but they actually had more resources, strangely, there, and actually worked a little bit better. Laser, which we'll talk about in a second, in LA was a great infamous example of person-based predictive policing because it really had a flawed system at the outset, and we'll talk just briefly about that. But just to put a point on this, the theory of the LASER program, the Los Angeles Strategic Extraction and Restoration Program, was, and I'm quoting, because it's offensive, the basic premise is to target with laser-like precision the violent repeat offenders and gang members who commit crimes in the specific target areas. The program is analogous to laser surgery, where a trained medical doctor uses modern technology to remove the tumors or improve eyesight. So they were trying to take the tumors out of society, human beings, using a system that basically was simple sums of you could add up these points, 5 points for a gang member, 5 points for parole, 5 points for a prior arrest, 5 points for violent crimes, and then one of the dumber ones, 1 point for every quality police contact. Because what happened was they had this list of higher numbers, and then police were told to go make contact with the chronic offenders, and they would look and say, "Oh, this person has a high number." So they go talk to him. He then gets another point. So the next day, they're like, "Well, this person has a higher point." They go talk to him, gets another point. And so it was literally creating a self-fulfilling prophecy simply by police conduct having nothing to do with the underlying sort of risk factors of the individuals, except for the fact they just added up simple sums. When the LA Inspector General looked at this program, they found a whole series of flaws. One, they weren't even doing what they're supposed to do, which is like sending a letter, conducting warrant checks. But what was really going on was there was no, even though they had a system and a theory, it wasn't actually working in practice. Some people on the list had no points. Didn't make sense. Some people had a lot. It seemed as if the points were almost assigned at random. Half the chronic offenders had almost no arrests. It just, again, looking at the data behind the data-driven policing showed that it really wasn't working the way it was supposed to work. And in fact, was probably harming people because they were essentially justified unconstitutional stops, if that makes sense. They were told to go stop chronic offenders, even though they didn't have suspicion. It wasn't supposed to use for suspicion. There weren't really policies in place. You think if you're going to roll this out, you might have strong policies. They didn't really have that. There weren't training protocols. It wasn't updated so that people would be in jail who'd be a chronic offender. And like, again, a system that in theory, I guess, identified riskier people in a community that pretty much failed in practice. It failed not just in terms of operationally, it failed in terms of it was reifying many of the structural inequities in the society, including bias of policing, fairness, and the fact that there really, if you dug down into, there wasn't actually anything behind the 5 points each for each factor. Like that was just like kind of made up as like a theory. And so even behind it, it really wasn't working. It was reifying some of the big problems. So, to go through a decade of experiments, in almost every city where predictive policing was tried, place-based or person-based, it's largely failed. LAPD shut down PredPol. It shut down its laser program. Chicago shut down its heat list. It shut down the sort of follow-on chronic offender situations. You've seen a few cities try to bring it back, like Dallas, who was doubled down into big data policing, but it really hasn't worked in any real way. And of course, it caused real impacts on individuals who were stopped by police, impacted by police in certain ways. So just a couple of thoughts about how we have approached predictive policing and what that should mean if you're thinking about the way individuals interact with police, the way communities should be thinking about policing, the way we collectively as a society, as lawyers, should be concerned about how we regulate and think about policing. I make the argument in an article that I wrote called Surveillance and the Timer Test. So we've sort of done like three different ways of approaching policing and predictive policing in specific. The first lens of analysis was just a trust lens. Like almost for that entire decade, it was the police deciding they had an idea, getting funding for that idea, running with that idea, and only later saying, maybe this idea doesn't really work that well. So this whole trust idea had its problems. We'll talk about that. We have had post the sort of countrywide protests after the murder of George Floyd, a move toward abolition. And one of the more successful sort of micro strategic campaigns has been to at least abolish predictive policing. Abolishing police is a big task, but abolishing predictive policing has actually been a relatively successful sort of microcosm battle that raises some really interesting questions about whether it was successful, whether it's valuable, whether it makes sense. But it was successful in Los Angeles, where they really did shut down predictive policing, even if data is still being used. And it has sort of turned the use of that term into kind of a toxic term that doesn't get used a whole lot anymore. We also tried to regulate it. One of the sort of implicit messages of the sort of letter that Senator Wyden sent to DOJ was, at least you have to regulate this, right? There are no rules in place. You haven't been paying attention about how it's being used, whether it's being audited. If you're going to use it, you should at least have rules, regulations, policies. And that's been an approach we've taken with a lot of sort of big data technologies that, we could regulate our way out of it. We'll have local rule sets, local legislation that would say you can do it, but you have to do it under these ways, and whether that makes sense, and whether there are other questions out there, which we'll talk about at the very end. So just very briefly, The trust lens, like this idea of we should trust the police and predictive policing, and we can debate this if you disagree, I would argue has largely failed. And it's failed for structural reasons. One is that there's almost never a chance to challenge predictive policing in court. It's kind of in this pre-constitutional moment where it would actually alert the police to go to a place, but then they would be using their own whatever they saw or whatever suspicions they had, and they would omit it from their police report, so you couldn't actually litigate in Fourth Amendment motions. It's fragmented, right? Police, there are about 18,000 different police departments in America. It's very hard to sort of target one particular algorithm, one particular company in one particular city and have that impact other places. It's always new. They kept changing it. It's funny to go through the history of the Chicago heat list. It had like 6 different names and 6 different rules sets about it because they get criticized and then they change what they were doing, and that made sense, of course, but also meant hard to sort of attack it because it was always a moving ball about how it was working. And a lot of the early things, the concern was the proprietary. You didn't actually know what was going on behind the algorithm, behind the machine learning, about why this area was predicted to be higher than somewhere else. Again, it was the company's like business to not release their algorithm, so they didn't necessarily do, or at least the data behind their algorithm, so didn't necessarily do that, but it made it hard to challenge in that way, and also requires experts, requires knowledge. Like, most people in this space most police officers are not data-driven experts, so very hard to evaluate when they were being sold by a vendor about whether to use it or not. It was hard for community groups to push back because they didn't understand it. It sounds scary, but no one really knew what was happening except for those of us who were following it. And the cost of the trust lens was pretty real. Like if you were a proponent of predictive policing, kind of lost out. Predpol is essentially shut down, now been bought out by Sound Thinking. The heat list is no more. Laser got shut down, and so a lot of the sort of early missteps had real consequences where it's hard to find a good example, good in quotes, good example of predictive policing actually working in America today. Sorry, I see a chat. Oh, sorry, there's a letter. If there were questions, I could always answer them too. But I'm just getting
I
through.
was just putting in a link to the
Yeah.
letter for the rest of
Yeah,
you.
thanks. Again, there's an open debate. I hope we actually have a conversation about sort of this idea of abolition of predictive policing. We've had policing without quote unquote predictive policing. You could easily have that again and not necessarily lose too much. On the other hand, there's an open question about if you're going to have policing and you have data about what's going on in your community, like shouldn't police have that? If anyone should have that, shouldn't they know where to go, where not to go to be more efficient and effective? Again, you can debate the underlying issue of whether you should have police, but once you have police, like, wouldn't you want them to be smarter in the sense of like having more information than less? Again, information may be wrong, might be distorting, it might be problematic, but there's a hard question about whether you're okay with it. Like, is your critique really policing, or is your critique policing tech? And can you have one without the other? And which one do you really want to have? Again, I think there's a valid argument about the sort of critique of place-based predictive policing, that the idea that you just want police randomly driving about on their own instincts and hunches, like that's better than having data and tracking them. I think there's an open question about that. Sorry. And then again, underlying those questions are really hard questions about who prioritizes these issues, who funds it, how much of a opportunity cost is there. If you're paying for a company to do predictive policing, it means you're not funding schools and education and job opportunities and everything else. Honest questions about whether the cost of these technologies is worth it. Sometimes that's nuanced. Like in LA, Predpol was giving the LAPD the stuff for free. They weren't actually making any money on it because they're trying to sell it to everywhere else. But again, query whether even if it was free, you'd want to use it. What are the consequences, and whether you're okay with it or not. The technocratic fixes, which is kind of the idea of like, can we legislate, regulate our way around it? Also, tempting to do something to at least not allow it to happen just on the whims of police. The more honestly, the whims of the vendors are selling the technology to police. There are challenges of like what governmental body is capable of doing the sort of audits and analysis of whether this predictive policing company or technology is better than this one. Look at your city council. Are they really going to be able to do that? Are there experts you can trust to do that? Should we set up like a NIST-like, AI-based system to test these before we roll it out? Maybe it's a response. And again, open question of like, what do we do? In part because, as we'll see in a second, like even though this sort of first generation of predictive policing technologies has largely died out, like the software algorithm you could buy, police are fully invested in data-driven policing. They're not calling it predictive policing anymore, but they are using data to figure out patrol routes. They're using data to resource officers. They are using data to figure out where to go and what to do. And while they might not be calling it predictive policing anymore, it's essentially the same thing. And we have to figure out as a society how we want to think about that. Right now, it's sort of been built into the back end of the data systems. And the question will be whether or not we're okay with it. Because again, this is a critique that comes from the abolitionists. If you are okay with the technology, you just want to regulate it, that means that you're essentially giving a green light to allowing predictive policing in your communities. If you're worried about like sort of structural racism in policing, like that's not going to change. You're not going to avoid it by just using a technology. And so you may actually be giving the green light to something that's just as problematic in its way. And if your response says, well, that's our democratic system, the response to that, of course, is, well, democracy isn't always so democratic. The people who are being policed the most may have lost the right to vote because they're a felon. They may not feel sort of the political empowerment to respond back to challenge the police because they don't want to be targeted. And so a lot of times when you say, well, democracy and the city council, the technocratic legislative thing wins, you're talking about the people with money and power and influence win. And that can lead to, racially unequal policing systems, and has, if you look at most major cities in America. So question of like what's next in this world of sort of that next iteration of predictive policing. I will give you what I think is just my future, which is we are seeing the rise of real-time crime centers, which if you can picture it are like centralized command centers with lots of video cameras, lots of data streams, 911 calls come in. You have video analytics running on those camera streams to be able to identify objects and people, and you could run facial recognition. We haven't seen that quite yet on the systems. And of course, because you are seeing where police are and seeing where crimes are, you have the data that you were talking about predictive policing, but just now it's in a real-time crime center. And so we're going to see the same predictive analytics run on that. Why? Because it's there. Like it's so easy. That's the easy part. The algorithm. Collecting the data was hard, but now you're going to have it there. And the question is, all right. So when that predictive analytics gets built into the back end of these systems, are you going to try to solve some of the identified problems that we should have learned if we were paying attention for the last decade, but maybe we haven't quite learned yet? And that it's an open question. I think that we are essentially blindly replacing the first generation predictive policing with this second generation sort of platform-based predictive policing without actually asking any of the hard questions that we should have asked if we've been thinking about this stuff over the last few years. And again, that is just one piece. Predictive policing as like crime data is just one piece of a larger world of a lot of data. Police officers are now kind of wired themselves, right? They have GPS on their body cams. They have body cams. They have we know where they are when the crime happens, so you can see the difference on a map. We have video cameras and digital analytics. We have the Internet of Things. We have Ring cameras. We have a whole world of surveillance that's coming in, and all of that will be used as like sort of the baseline information to predict where we need to direct our resources as a police department. And that, in my mind, is just the next generation of predictive policing that we're going to see. And it opens up questions like, so what do we do with that? Is that going to impact civil rights or liberties? Is it going to impact Fourth Amendment freedoms? Have we really thought about it in any real way? And those, of course, add a lot of hard questions about the debate about police power and what we want police to do in our society, which is obviously an open question, how we want police to respond. Again, there's an interesting thought process of the deterrent rationale of predictive policing, which was supposed to, unless they did, but it was supposed to actually lessen police contact with the community, because if you were right that the burglar was going to show up at this place at this time, and you put the police car there, you would both deter the burglar from doing what they were planning on doing and lower the arrest rate because they wouldn't have done the crime, right? So there's a theory there that if you were correct, you could both lower crime and lower arrests just by being smarter on the data. Interesting debate. Never really got a full fleshed out debate about it. Mostly because, and it's true, that a lot of times what was happening is that the police were essentially being used for mechanisms of social control to regulate poverty, regulate things that were going on and crimes resulting from poverty. And so the sort of police power that was being amplified by predictive policing power was just another argument for why we needed less police. And so we've been having that debate as a nation all the way through. So the last slide, so I'm gonna get off my slides after this, but we can open up and have a discussion about questions. Is like, whether the focus should be thinking about the problem of tech or the problem of policing. And when you focus on the problem of tech, sometimes you don't focus on all of the other like structural, social, economic realities that are generating the thing that you're concerned about, public safety and crime. We have to think about how the technology will be misused. I'm sort of fearful of these real-time crime centers that are being built up because they really are centralizing power in a way we haven't seen before. We really are getting more of a command center than we've had. And again, whether there aren't other ways to sort of respond to this rather than just focusing on the technology. My sort of lessons learned from the predictive policing battles of the past is that even if you shut down predictive policing 1.0, even if Predpol goes out of business, doesn't mean that the data-driven push of policing will go away. And that means that the same problems emerge. They're just actually harder to see and they're harder to debate and discuss. And I think that is intentional. I think the companies were trying to do that. But I also think that it makes the debate harder. It's easier to target a particular software company and algorithm. It's not much harder to target the entire kind of back-end data system of the police. Anyway, that's where we are today. And with that, I will get out of my slides here and get out of my thing. Stop sharing. That's what I meant to say. Sorry, stop share. And then we can discuss and debate this.
What an amazing presentation. Thank you. I feel like I just received an awful lot of information. So my brain is very full right now in a very valuable way. Um, a lot of initial reactions. One, obviously, I'm sure you know about this, but the mayor of DC recently announced a new DC crime lab that real time crime lab that is expected in the next couple of years. So I think this presentation is all the more timely, particularly in my current capacity as being dual hatted, working for both the ABA and DC government in thinking through how that can play out. So thank you for that additional framing. One of the questions that I've posed to the students for this semester, which you may have already answered in our second week, is in what way does predictive policing and the role of technology in policing impact how community oriented policing can be? And I definitely heard a lot of reference to that, both in how the use of this technology can be further isolating, can lead to additional stigmatization, can further disenfranchise different communities. But I thought the one point that really stuck out to me was in thinking about the crime reduction component, how limited the actual community orientation and outreach was even baked into that thinking, and that it was about placing a car in an area to deter crime, to have officers present, but not anything about the outreach and the trust building and the legitimacy required to forge ongoing relationships between communities and law enforcement. That it is still seen, to me, that doesn't seem as preventative. It does still seem reactive. And I'm not sure what my question is here, but just wondering if you can reflect a little bit on how that that distinction between or the disconnect between community orientation and the role of tech.
I think there really was a disconnect in the beginning where The model was, look, we have this policing thing, we can add a technological power to policing, and we'll just do policing better. And what it led to was that we could somehow have a technological fix for the deeper structural problems of society. I always, joke like the main problem with predictive policing is the policing part. Like the idea of doing risk analysis, there might be some environmental vulnerability in this neighborhood that should be addressed. That's good to know. The idea that your solution is simply parking a police car there seems really short-sighted. Like, what's that going to do? That's like the most temporary band-aid that you could ever imagine. Like maybe if there's a problem in that area, like build a park, build, better lighting, figure out what is that risk that is creating the need for or the reasons for this violence or this crime or this theft, and try to address it in that way. Like that would be a smart way to use the same data. And to their credit, the folks at the risk train modeling, which now is SimC, have partnered in Newark, sort of like listening to the critiques of what was going on. Predpol was sort of demonized for that sort of simplistic response and saying, well, if we can give this data to community members and we let them see what the risks are, maybe they can respond in sort of non-carceral ways. Maybe they can respond in ways that are going to sort of build up the area as opposed to just policing or surveilling the area. And it's worked, I think, in a little bit, in many ways. At least it engages the community. It gives the information and thus the power of that information to the community to decide what to do. And again, the open question is like, why on earth do you have, why? The only reason why predictive policing became a thing is that we funded police to solve social problems as opposed to funding other social entities to fund social problems. You literally just follow the money. It's all the money. The money went to police for predictive policing. Same money could have gone to like the mayor's office for building up, at-risk areas, but it was much easier politically to fund predictive policing. So we got that. But again, different ways to approach it. And I hope, I wish we had learned our lessons that there would be more constructive ways, more inclusive ways, more community-oriented ways to approach it. Because again, if you're that community, you say, wait a minute, so you're going to pay X millions of dollars for an algorithm to mark where crime is instead of putting that money to like build a park so we don't have to watch the crime. I think you pick the park.
Okay, invite questions from the rest of the group. Okay, great, Melanie, thank you, because otherwise I'm just going to keep. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, I have the same reaction. Like there's a lot like swimming in my head. Like thank you for that. That was really informative, a lot of information. And I feel like I'm gonna need a minute to process. But one thing that you said that struck me, and I was curious if you had more, I'm the same, like I'm not sure what my question is, but you mentioned like something about predictive policing should, in theory, sort of reduce the interactions with police over time, which sort of makes sense. And I was thinking, I've been doing some research into Sound Thinking's Shot Spotter, and I see like cities that like have like a large amount of responses from police due to Shot Spotter alerts. And the same sort of idea. I think the idea would be that over time, we would have less interaction with police because we're in theory removing these sort of dangerous elements. So I wondered if you had anything else to say about that aspect, about does predictive policing or does this technology, is it supposed to reduce interactions with police sort of? And does it increase it? Does it like, I don't know if that's a fully formed question or not.
No, it's a great question. It's a really hard question. So let's take place-based predictive policing, this idea of what Predpol and HunchLab and now Sound Thinking are doing. So if you go through Sound Thinking's platform, you'll see this service they provide called Resource Router. Resource Router is, they won't call it that, it's predictive policing. They bought the sort of nuts and bolts of HunchLab. They bought the technology behind Predpol, and essentially their pitch to departments that are using their gunshot audio is, look, we can also help you use the data you have to be more efficient, more effective, and to do your job better. And so that is essentially predictive policing because they are taking past data to put it through some machine learning to predict future places. But in sort of early iterations of the project, they did some interesting kind of creative things. So one thing, and again, it's HunchLab that's now Sound Thinking. So I don't know if the current management accepts this, is going to follow through on this. But again, it's an interesting experiment, interesting to talk about. So what they did in the early stages was say, look, we know that there are two problems. One is if we use the data for where police go and see crime as part of our sort of data set, the computer's going to keep predicting to go back to that area. So we're going to be over policing that area. So we need to do something with our algorithm to essentially not make it automatic and put buffers in. And so what they did was, for a couple of those districts, they said, look, if you've gone to this area again and the algorithm is predicting you should go there again, we're going to stop it. We're going to say, don't go there. You can't go there anymore. And so there was like an override function. So you could use the algorithm to not over police in a kind of creative way. The other problem they had, or other problem they recognized was, well, wait a minute. So you have these cops in Chicago driving around. They are getting out of the car, and they've been told to go to this area. They don't know what they're, it doesn't tell you what to do with the area. It says this is a high crime area. So what they did was they got up there and they harassed people, and well, that's not helpful for community relations. So and this is again a kind of a techno solution to the problem of police abuse or brutality sort of attitude was, look, we're going to have these officers get out and make officers go to individuals on the street and have them fill out questionnaires about their attitude toward policing. And we're going to measure that. We're going to see how many questionnaires you get filled out, which again puts the officer in a weird position. Like, so wait a minute, I have to go to this area, I have to get out, I have to take a questionnaire. If I beat up the person, they're clearly not going to be very supportive of my questionnaire. Maybe they would, but probably not. I have to be nice to them. And so there's this weird like techno solution to try to trick officers to be like pleasant to people so their community scores would go up. Just an interesting experiment that, again, if you are an officer, you're relatively junior in the thing, you're told to you get measured and promoted based on the things, your metrics. One of your metrics is how many of these surveys you take and how good your score is. Kind of an interesting way of doing it. And it was all built into the kind of the original Hunch Lab idea that we could use technology to do something good as opposed to bad. Now, did that work in practice? I don't know. But it's an interesting thought experiment about how you could try to change this interaction between policing and people in that way. Now, is Resource Radar doing that? No, I don't believe they are, but you can ask them when you talk to the ShotSpotter people. And is it a problem if people don't have buy-in into it? Sure. I mean, one of the funny things about the LAPD audit of Predpol was they found that the entity that was least bought in was the police officers who didn't actually want to follow an algorithm and do this stuff. And so they were told to go to a particular box and they'd like just drive right through it. They weren't doing anything there, but they could check off, I did what I was supposed to do. And they weren't even following the rules. Like they weren't even doing what they were supposed to do. So again, the community wasn't too happy with it, but also the police weren't too happy with it. So again, you have to think about how the technology is going to intersect, these human beings who are living in these areas and who are policing these areas, and whether it's actually doing what you hope it would be doing.
Derek.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you again. And I'm just kind of curious on how this issue's been litigated. You brought it up a little bit, but I don't know if you can explain more. I see this like, if it's in the reasonable suspicion realm, it's got to be put in the affidavit, and maybe rules regarding the same, and including that formula in the same, is that where it shows up, and where you expect to see it, and where, kind of the courts can then weigh in on it, and I guess also then what rulemaking if it's not going to be in the affidavit.
So generally speaking, what we have seen is that it does not make it into the pretrial Fourth Amendment litigation of a motion. Like you would think what would happen is if you were sort of following the rules, like, oh, I was patrolling at this time, at this point, the computer told me to go to this location to be on the lookout for burglaries. I went to that area, I saw this guy with a crowbar and a black bag, and so I stopped him. Right? You'd think that that would make sense, and the officer, in order to justify why they made the stop, would rely on the information they had, including this computer program. But generally, we haven't seen that. You can search Westlaw for predictive policing, and you only find a handful of cases, and none like that squarely tee up the issue of how you are supposed to sort of evaluate in terms of is it reliable, is it trustworthy? And I think part of the reason you don't see it is because no one wanted to litigate that. It would have to be a pretty serious case for the police to want to gamble to have to litigate the validity of this algorithm in a before it happened. A lot of times it's easier to just have the officer testify about what else they saw and ignore the fact that the reason they were there was sort of because of a predictive tip. If it becomes litigated, I wrote an article early on about predictive policing and reasonable suspicion, how it should factor in. And I think it's an interesting question. Person-based predictive policing is even more interesting, right? So if you have this information about this person, right? If you know this person is a quote unquote high risk 500 plus, and you see him doing something, like, shouldn't that factor in? Like, if you were a cop and you knew the person, had been arrested 6 times before and was involved in a gang just because your own personal knowledge, you're allowed to use that information. Why would you say you couldn't use the information that came to you in a database? It doesn't, I don't know why a court would kick that out. And yet it creates some problems if you're not sure what does it mean that you're 500 plus? Where do we get that information? Is it biased? Is it a problem? And so I think because it's so messy, the prosecutors who had a case, the police officer who had a case, like, just kind of like didn't use it in their justification, and could usually win without it. And so we haven't seen, much to my chagrin, who really wrote like several articles on it and would have loved for it to have shown up in the courts, haven't really seen it play out in any major Fourth Amendment question. Although, of course, it's a factor, or could be a factor, in a quote unquote high crime area, because what else is it but a predicted high crime area?
Alex.
Yeah, just going off of Derek's question, and it kind of seems like with this influx of new technology, ShotSpotter being one, and then the predictive policing, if we see an issue like this appear in front of the courts, is it going to be the type where it's multiple, I guess, new technologies intersecting at once, or do you foresee something like this evolving on its own, at least in a litigation aspect? I guess I can clarify if need be as
No,
well.
I think it's a really interesting question, a really great question, in part because the way we have thought about these sort of technologies has always been kind of like tools, like predictive policing as a tool, or we'll use ShotSpotter as a tool, as opposed to thinking them as sort of interconnected systems. And one of the things I'm foreshadowing for you, because I think you'll see it in the next like 5-10 years as we talk about these, is this move to platforms. Like Sound Thinking now, ShotSpotter, wants to be the platform of policing. Their in was, if we essentially sell these, gunshot audio sensors to cities, we'll be able to then have like an in, and then we'll be able to sell them other kind of data systems. So, for example, once we have the contract, we can then sell them our resource router, or we can send them our equivalent, like kind of a Google search for police data, and they will have the platform contract. You're seeing kind of a battle with other companies. So Axon, which is formerly known as Taser, has the body camera contract, right? They gave essentially body cameras to the world, recognizing the real money was in the back end data of keeping all that. Every cop who goes on the street with a body cam has a footage running. Someone's got to store that, collect it, make it usable for court. Guess what? Axon also does that. And Axon just bought this company called Fusus, which is a small startup that's now just going to get big, which basically creates these real-time crime centers, linking ordinary cameras like the ones on, private businesses with the city cameras, and putting them all into one sort of on the cloud global system. And so Axon's like in to be the platform is, oh, well, we'll give you the police body cameras so we can get the contracts. And so what began as a discussion of, well, should ShotSpotter sound audio be a factor in reasonable suspicion, will soon morph into, well, should, the resource allocation, resource router, predictive policing, plus ShotSpotter, plus the video cameras we have, be a factor for reasonable suspicion? And it's going to make the analysis much harder, because we have largely thought about Fourth Amendment policing tools. If you go back to all the cases you read in Crim Pro, they're all about like one-off tools, like a thermal imager, or like a plane flight, or like a single beeper, or even like the GPS. Once you get into the GPS systems and cell site, the court's starting to think, wait a minute, this system of surveillance is actually a problem. That's why you get different answers in Jones and Carpenter. But if you, besides Jones, Carpenter, and Riley, the entire Fourth Amendment is based on like truly not just analog, but antiquated technologies. And the idea of having those come together is going to be a new challenge for lawyers like you guys who are going out to figure out, like, you're going to be using a lot of those in every prosecution in every defense case. And the Fourth Amendment analysis and get kind of muddy because we like it if we can just talk about how did predictive policing impact reasonable suspicion, and not all of the other information that's gonna come in and impact human officers on the street trying to make these pretty quick decisions in real time. And so we're going to see that a lot. Again, the metaphor of the real-time crime center is a great one because it links all of these technologies together in one thing. Like you're getting the 911 call, the video camera automatically goes to the scene, the shot spotter alerts and confirms the shooting there. You see the ALPRs capture the camera or the license plates of all of the cars leaving the scene. The drone flies there and captures the scene. Like, so how does the Fourth Amendment apply to that? There's your law review article, right?
I've told the students this already, but part of the impetus to the theme for this semester was I attended the International Association of Chiefs of Police conference back in October. And the amount of policing technology that existed there and that was on offer was mind-boggling. And maybe I use that term a little too often, but
No,
maybe, or perhaps my mind is just
it
too
is
easily boggled.
it is both mind-boggling, but also probably, like, again, a microcosm of the problem of policing in America. So if you can describe it, but like essentially, if you ever seen like the Computer Electronics Festival in Vegas, or like all these like cool, like fancy new technologies, well, picture that, but for police. And then picture a bunch of police chiefs who are kind of underfunded, kind of under-resourced in terms of knowing what to do, being wined and dined by vendors who want to sell them something. And again, if you're a chief of police today, like, you're not a data scientist. You probably actually were on the beat with like mimeograph copies of pens, and it's hard to evaluate what's real, what's not. And there's both money to be made there because you want to make these contacts, but also like a lot of federal money. The Real-Time Crime Center that in DC and other places is there because the Biden infrastructure money is going to Real-Time Crime Center. We're building the infrastructure of surveillance through federal funds and COVID funds. So a lot of non-used COVID funds is being used for surveillance. And again, so you have this world where we're building these, and these vendors are not taking advantage, but kind of taking advantage of the fact there's free money, free federal money, and chiefs who are kind of unsure about how to respond. And the reaction, what happens is suddenly some city gets a contract for a technology that they're not really sure it works. There's no place to have vetted it before. There's only a handful of people paying attention. The community doesn't know about it, and no one ever pays attention to vendor proprietary purchases anyway for policing. And so it just happens, and you show up the next day, and there's like a drone flying over without a whole lot of debate.
What I found so interesting was the different sales pitches for the different people because I was walking through with my ABA badge on. And so when I would attempt to talk to some of these vendors about, like, tell me what it is that you're selling, tell me how we know that it is working. And a lot of the responses that I received were, oh, we know because it has reduced crime in this area by this data metric. It will create more, the focus from the majority of the vendors that I spoke with was on community safety. But you stick around long enough and you get to hear the sales pitch to the police. Obviously, they're showing up in uniform, they're a little easier to identify. And so for them, it was, this will keep your officers safe. This is focused on the long-term viability of your organization. And the fact that those were done so distinctly, again, that this not peer reviewed. This is just an anecdotal study that I conducted because I was at the conference on my own and needed something to kill the time with. I thought was so interesting that there was such a different tack in how the technology was being promoted to different audiences and trying to determine what would work based off of basically the uniform that you were coming to the conversation with. So I think it's, yeah, definitely an area for additional review. Other questions, reflections? Elizabeth.
So one thing that stood out to me was, is the data compiled for the red zones, is that available only to police or is it available to private companies? Because the thing that sticks out to me is if a community is already having difficulties and they're consistently being put in a red zone, I could see there being a lack of incentive to develop in that area, which would further harm that community.
I think that's a great point. So I think the answer of like who has the data, who controls it, probably means it depends. A lot of times that information is like crime data. It's like where the burglary happened, where the car theft happened. So that's generally with police. Obviously, many cities like publicly put out where their crimes happen. Like there's reporting requirements, and some cities just do it, so you know. DC has that. They have a list of public crimes everywhere you are, and so it can have an impact. Now, the those 500 by 500 square foot boxes that Predpol was doing, those weren't available to anyone but the officers, and they actually changed daily. So they would show up for the shift change, and they would get their boxes for the day, or their computers would have it updated. And so it wasn't like they were fully like redlining or black, putting a red box on a particular area. Say this is a high crime area, and it will always be that way. But they were also um, not thinking about sort of collateral consequences of, well, what would happen if this area was designated, a high crime area, or was like that clearly has impacts on insurance rates, property values, who wants to live there, businesses going in, and all of those things. Now, people know that maybe without even the crime data, but the early use cases were all like police focused. We're trying to give police officers like a competitive advantage in this daily pursuit of crime, give them information. And while the companies had it, they weren't at that moment reselling it in any way. They weren't using it for other options. But the data collection is there and is used, right? Again, if you Google Washington, D.C., you can Google like the safer neighborhoods and the non-safe neighborhoods, and that's based on people just scraping the web of the police data that the police puts out there on their little map of Washington, and tells you which areas are more likely to be, the subject of crime and not.
Other questions, reflections, thoughts? Hoping y'all have one because I'm struggling to come up with the words for what is going through my mind right now. So come up with a question so I have more time to think this through.
I I guess I can kind of hop in a little bit, and I'm texting with Nathan, who's on the call, and we're talking about while this fits under the reasonable suspicion framework, I it seems very easy to me to get probable cause just based on the possible level of surveillance that this type of structure allows for. Like say in 10 years, you put all these tools together and you can put, drone footage as well as surveillance footage in a police officer's cruiser if need be. And I mean, is that far from the reality that we're heading towards, or am I off base there?
No, I think that you're right to see that future. So I think there are two things. So one is, can past information, past crime, be accurate enough, valid enough to be predictive such that police can act on it, right? So the fact that there had been crimes in this block in the past, should that have any relevance to what's happening right now when the officer shows up? That's an open question, right? Like it is true that some areas are known for more crime. It doesn't mean it's happening at that moment. No algorithm is that accurate. And so you might say it shouldn't be relevant at all. Like, sure, you can have this in the background information, but it shouldn't factor into your decision because you should just see what you're seeing, and that's what it is. So that's a piece of it, right? Like if we're talking about predictive policing, the idea that you can predict. Same thing with people, right? So this person has been arrested 4 times in the last month. He's in a gang. He's on parole, and he's driving a car. Is that suspicion? Like maybe he's going to his mom's house. Maybe he's going to church. Maybe he's going to get a job. Can you stop him because of what he did in the past? Right? Those are hard questions. And you say, well, reasonable suspicion is a low standard. Take the totality of circumstances. Anything really can factor into reasonable suspicion. High crime area, look like a profile of a drug dealer. We've used a lot of vague things there. Why can't this be one of them? So that's an open question, which we can debate. I'm curious what you guys think. Should that in reasonable suspicion? Second question above that is, okay, assuming it could be used for reasonable suspicion, is that enough for probable cause? Can you stop someone because they are in a high crime, this predicted high crime area, at the right time in the right location, and the computer's really sure a crime was going to occur there. So all you do is you were walking down the street. Maybe you were going to commit a crime, but it was the algorithm told you. And that seems to be too far, right? As of the idea that you'd be actually arrested, you go to jail because the algorithm said you were going to commit a burglary. Like, what? That doesn't make any sense. So two pieces to the predictive policing problem, and then add just the third piece, and we can open it up to your question of, okay, well, what if you have the video footage or the drone footage, and you were able to do what they're doing now in these real-time crime centers is they call it virtual patrol. They sit there, they get a tip or they get a gunshot, and the camera pans to the corner and they see a human being in their camera streams, and they watch them. And is that enough? Like they're on the scene, they're watching the computer. Is that enough for probable cause? If they see a hand-to-hand transaction, is that good enough? Maybe, right? I mean, probably, right? But so take those. What do you guys think? What do you think about those like three options? If you're the law clerk to the judge and they say, hey, we got this case where the predictive policing algorithm said this block, this hour, this time, officer followed the rules and saw this person, can that be part of reasonable suspicion? Is there probable cause? And then separately, what if there's like video confirmation? What say you?
I do believe that in the first two scenarios, when we're dealing with that more of the algorithm aspect, the predictive aspect of it, I pray if I'm the clerk, I'm saying, look, there seems to be in Fourth Amendment jurisprudence broadly, there seems to be a reactive quality to how we deal with policing. It is a response to a stimulus in the same way that going through the adversarial process is. However, that would be, that there's a big asterisk beside that, dealing with how accurate are these algorithms going to get in the long term. And personally, I pray that they never get that accurate to where we're able to pick up on it point by point. But on the third option, it's based on the current law, based on, even Riley in these other cases that are dealing with technology, I think you get to probable cause when you're putting all of these things together. I mean, it's when, I guess, the nomenclature would be, it's when it's obvious that there's a crime has been committed in layperson terms. So putting all those things together, hand-to-hand transfer, I think you get there. And then on the first two, I pray that it never does get there, I guess.
What do other people think?
Yeah, I mean, on a practical basis, I mean, they're going to do a Terry stop, and you're going to ask like, what a reasonable officer like do in that moment, utilizing this information. I think that would be one vector that the court could address this issue is, defining these standards and trainings for utilizing this information.
So it could be a factor.
Yeah.
You could say, look, I stopped this person because the algorithm said it was likely there was going to be a crime here, and I'm just a cop. I'm not a data scientist. That was one factor in the totality. But not enough for probable cause?
I don't know. I mean, like Alex mentioned, it depends when all this artificial intelligence uses this data and really gets declaratory or affirmative and very determinative. That's when you get into the weird what's that show that everyone likes to quote right now with the VR and all the weird stuff happening. I forgot that show, but we get into sci-fi with that stuff. Yeah.
What do the people think? I'm not your law professor, so I can't call you out, but
I recognize I don't have the qualifications to comment on this. I just find it fascinating.
the problem, of course, no one. So imagine you're clerking for that judge. Like, they don't know. You guys now know more about predictive policing than they do, right? And so you could easily imagine some equivalent of this will come up, and then you have to argue by analogy. Like, isn't this sort of like a tip? Like, hey, I think there's supposed to be a crime. I heard that there was going to be a drug. This guy was going to be using this house for drug deals. Happens all the time. Is it like a profile? We've had enough of these situations that repeats over time. Everyone knows it's a high drug area. What do we do about it? Can't we use that factor in? Like, do you blind officers to it? Because in some ways, everything else going to those officers' information also could be wrong, also could be racially biased, also could be just a mistake, right? And we don't say you can't take a tip from a neighbor who might have all sorts of ulterior motives. We say, no, whatever, we'll take it as one factor, the totality, and then go see there and see what's confirmed. There have been experiments where the sort of video analytics that we're talking about will be trained on, look, if you see the following thing, that's an assault. So alert, send the cops to the assault. So they've seen, thousands and hundreds of thousands of hours of assaults. The video analytics, which just takes objects and turns them into, ones and zeros and shading things, says, oh, this pattern of action is an assault. I've been taught on that. I will alert and send the cops there who arrive on the scene looking for the assault and don't know if it's like, a fraternity party, like giving big hugs and like wrestling around, or like a gang. No one knows, right? And the question is like, how much could you arrest because the algorithm said, hey, no, I just saw an assault. I've been trained on that. Hopefully not. But a lot of times when the officers show up on the scene, the crime's over, right? So how much can you rely on? And we're going to get to these problems of like, do you trust the technology? And again, this is just the past history. The technology has usually been like kind of wrong and kind of based on ideas, theories that make sense in the abstract, but have never been proven. To this day, we don't know if any of the predictive policing technologies like work to reduce crime, mostly because we don't know what reduces crime, right? And we don't have it's the real world. You don't have a counterfactual where you can do an objective test. Sometimes crime goes up, sometimes it goes down. It could be completely independent of what technology runs, and it doesn't have anything to do with whether it's good or bad.
Other thoughts, questions? I guess one thing that I'm thinking about as I'm hearing all of this, I rarely feel that less data is going to be the answer. So I recognize that we have been compiling all of this information, particularly, and forgive me, folks, but I'm kind of in the weeds of DC, so I'm thinking a lot about the kind of data that we're collecting here, and feeling like there is definitely value in determining where and how crime is taking place. But as I'm hearing this, I'm wondering if instead of the police being responsible for retaining this information, if instead providing access to violence interrupters or other social support mechanisms so that they have more awareness of this information and can deploy alternative response in lieu of it being seen as a policing or an issue to be policed, but instead being sort of a tip for other responders to be aware of and to provide additional support mechanisms around if there might be additional value and bring us back to the value that what a community oriented approach to public safety can be. And
I think that the best thinkers about it recognize that you shouldn't be talking about crime as much as like risk. What are the things going on that are creating these risk factors, and can you identify using data why they're risks? And the answer doesn't have to be policing. It could be reducing that risk. In fact, if you're policing, you've probably lost already, right? You're responding to the problem as opposed to trying to get ahead of the problem and understand the problem. And so, for example, if you're studying crime patterns of, well, why are these assaults happening at this part, and you sort of, oh, well, school gets out at 3 o'clock and the kids are walking this way and they're waiting here and this is where the conflict happens. Well, maybe you can do something at that sort of location where you see the repeated assaults to respond to a community presence, so maybe there won't be a fight there if everyone's watching. And those kinds of insights aren't necessarily about policing. Policing always feels like the last resort, sort of shows you've failed if you have to go arrest your way out of it. If you're trying to figure out, well, what are the things going on here? Why are these, crimes happening? The vast majority of the crimes are happening, based on like some like poverty angle, right? That you could respond to with, non-carceral responses and more community responses. I grew up in DC. I've lived here, most of my life, and we keep failing. Like it's the same failure. I was a public defender in DC for 9 years. The same problems, the same rhetoric for the mayor, the same everything is happening again, and we've largely not responded to those underlying issues. Even as the city has gotten a lot wealthier, even as the city has sort of gotten like smarter about thinking about policing as a response, we still haven't adapted, and we sort of revert pretty quickly to the old way of doing things, which is what's happening right now as the pendulum swings back. But I think you're right to say that that data could be helpful, but if you keep it all in the police, if you say this is police data and not public safety community data, your response has tended to be policing. If the money from the federal infrastructure funds goes to build a police surveillance state in your city, like that's what you're going to do instead of taking those millions and millions and millions of dollars and using them to build the community so you don't have to watch it. Like, they're not putting the real-time crime center in Northwest Washington where I live, not because because of the privilege and money that's involved here, right? And if you sort of resource the communities you wanted to surveil to build it up, you might not have to spend the money to watch it. But instead, the money is going to go to surveillance, not go there. So there'll be a justification to surveil it in some weird way. It's sort of self-fulfilling about where you direct your resources. So yes, I think we could have that information, and it would be a good conversation to have. And it's funny, DC has, since I was, a young public defender in 2000, had the equivalent of person-based predictive policing. They literally, at the time, it was books. They literally had big books of the community, of the neighborhoods, and the crews who were, and they knew who was fighting whom, because for whatever reason, DC's violence is like block based and like who you grew up with, not about some major thing. And so they literally, I remember sitting there, looking. It was my client and his community, his cousins and his friends, and they were all in a book. And that was proto person-based predictive policing before we had algorithms, almost like in 2000. I mean, we had algorithms, but no one was using them. We used paper and pens and other things like at that time. But the idea was we knew that, and yet we still haven't been able to sort of respond to those underlying problems. And I'm sure the faces of the kids in those books are like parents themselves with their kids in some other database. It's sad that we haven't, sort of solved these underlying poverty issues here in DC.
Yeah, it's the Familiar Faces Initiative. So that is still being done within the district across different government agencies. They meet weekly, talk about who has been shot, who they knew to be involved in the shooting, in an attempt to disrupt ongoing violence patterns.
That's person-based predictive policing with a different name, right?
Mhm.
That's the same thing they were doing in Chicago. It's the same thing they're doing in LA. They
Mhm.
just have done it better because it hasn't become a focus of community outrage.
Well, there was the gang database
Yeah.
that has recently been dismantled. So there has been a little bit of attention being paid to how that can be problematic. But again, it is still being done just by under a different name. So yeah, other questions, reactions, fears.
I have many fears, but I will not be sharing them here.
I know this is definitely not dissuaded any of the fears that I have, but that is the power of knowledge. And so I am very grateful for this presentation. And I think it has really set us up for a critical lens, which is what I was hoping for the remaining sessions. So just to tee up what we are anticipating, Professor Ferguson, for you as well as for the rest of the group, next week we are hearing from some folks from Polis Solutions. They're going to be talking about body-worn cameras, analyzing the data to determine how we are using the information that body-worn cameras are providing to us, if and how we know that they are working, again, both to ensure the safety of the community, promote trust and legitimacy in police, and also potentially promote the safety of law enforcement themselves. On March 1st, we'll be hearing from Haley Schaefer at Age Datalytics, who is talking about using data to drive public safety, so coming at it from more of a community approach. Then on March 8th, this is going to be a juicy one. We got Thomas Chittum from Sound Thinking, and he is the legal advisor for their group, and he'll be talking about ShotSpotter, what we know, as well as some of the other technology that they have recently obtained, what their goals are from that work. Then March 15th, we'll be hearing from Christopher, I misspelled his name, Christopher Slobogin at Vanderbilt, talking about policing data, how it's being retained, how it's shared, what the law around both the retention and the sharing looks like. As I mentioned earlier, April 12th, hearing from Marcia Thompson at Aurora University about legal and ethical considerations in social media surveillance. And then Jared Fishman from the Justice Innovation Lab will be with us on April 19th to discuss forecasting the future of algorithms and AI in the criminal legal system. I tried reaching out during the week to someone who has oversight over some of these policing robots to come and speak to us. They gave me a hard no. So if y'all have recommendations on other organizations, other thinkers that are exciting to you in the area of policing and AI, please throw those suggestions my way. We've got one or two more sessions that I'm currently looking to schedule. And I don't know, I love these conversations. I love hearing from each of you about who might be an interesting contributor to these conversations. But in the meantime, Professor Ferguson, thank you so much for the research that you have done, for the work that you have put into publishing your research, for sharing your Friday evening with us, and the passion, the curiosity, and I don't know, the willingness to do the work and see a better future for all of us, hopefully. And if it's not better, then to keep asking the critical questions so that we all continue to fight the good fight. Thank you so much for being with us, and look forward to staying connected.
Sure. Thank you very much. Just two quick things in today's news. So one, you may have seen for police body cams, the NYPD just had this issue where their NYPD officers were assaulted by these undocumented migrants, whatever, and they had only released a snippet of the body cam, and the full body cam was released today. It tells a completely different story, and it's a great example of like who should have the data. If you lead with police, you'll have like a week of misleading stories where these officers were just beat up for no reason, and you look at the full video which they released today, it shows a completely different story where the police instigated it all. The guys weren't doing anything wrong, and again, who has the data controls who wins out. Same thing with ShotSpotter. Interesting stuff happening right now, a debate about ShotSpotter and new sort of analyses of what they've done and not done, so the cost benefits, not in terms of money, but in terms of time for officers who aren't going to other places because they're chasing shot spotters. There was a recent report that was just done, and they'd been debating in the news and like op-eds just this week, just today really, about like whether it makes sense to keep those. So again, like the idea you think makes sense, shot spotter, you go to a gunshot detention where you need to go, but the idea of like if you keep going there and you're not going to other places, does it have other costs? Like interesting structural system problems all happening today. If you want to, go on social media and see the debates. But thank you for the time. Thank you for the opportunity to present, and good luck with it all. It's really interesting stuff, and there are no answers, so you're as qualified as anyone else to solve them for the future.
Thank you very much.
Sure. I'm gonna hop off, I guess, right? Bye.
Of course, yeah, that's great.
Bye.
Folks, I'm going to stick around just to talk to those who have questions about final assignments. But if that is not you, if you know the direction in which you are going, if you have a clear idea and understanding and have discussed it with your supervisor, you are also welcome to hop. But because this is probably more of a one-on-one thing, I will pause the recording and speak to y'all off the record.